Hello and welcome to this webinar. I hope you all can hear me. My name is Helle Nielsen. I'm Event and Marketing Coordinator at Interacoustics, and I will be the moderator of this webinar. The webinar today is the subject is hearing threshold estimation in adults using the auditory late response. Now it's time to introduce today's presenter, Michael Maslin, which is international clinical trainer at Interacoustics Academy.
Thank you very much, Helle. So welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming to today's webinar, which we've entitled "Hearing Threshold Estimation in Adults Using the Auditory Late Response." Now, I just want to mention a little bit of the motivation for this particular webinar. Some of you may recall the prior one that we conducted a few weeks ago, which was referring to the ASSR, and that was optimized for hearing threshold estimation in infants. That formed rather the motivation for that particular talk. So in order to close the loop and cover the age range, we thought we'd add this webinar here related to the same type of clinical task, but in adults. So over the course of the webinar, I'd like to just mention a little of the history of the auditory late response. I always think it's nice to be provided with a little historical context where possible, and then we'll think a little bit of the clinical considerations, actually how to measure the auditory late response, principally by way of a comparison with the auditory brainstem response, which I tend to think is more established and more commonly understood. So we can use that as a sort of baseline by which to compare this other measure, which is somewhat less commonly practiced, I think, in clinics, certainly in the UK, where I'm based right now. So without further ado, let's move on. So I just wanted to, as I say, mention a little bit of the historical context first of all. And what I'm showing here is essentially a chart recording of some EEG activity, electroencephalographic activity, which is where you have sensors, in this case a number of them, 32 sensors, electrodes that are attached to the surface of the scalp, and they can measure the minor voltage fluctuations, the tiny voltage fluctuations of the ongoing neural activity. And it was all the way back in the 1930s that just literally using this raw data, the research couple of Pauline and Hallowell Davis first identified the auditory evoked potential arising from the auditory cortex, and the reason for this is that it was large enough to be able to see even in the raw chart recordings, as you can see on the screen here. However, you might wonder that it was somewhat cumbersome to analyze this response in any great detail in its raw form, and you know, the best way to improve signal to noise ratio is by averaging many responses together. And it wasn't until perhaps the 1960s when averaging computers were able to take over and perform this task more efficiently that research really took off in this particular field. And it was all motivated really by a desire to obtain an objective measure of hearing sensitivity. Now, clinicians at that time would have been limited to behavioural measures, and in infants, the infant distraction test would have been the primary measure. And even when it's conducted by experienced clinicians in an optimized fashion, the limitations of that particular test, the lower age limit to which it applied, was well known, perhaps 6 to 8 months at the lowest level. So a desire to lower that by the use of an objective measure was what drove the research. And Although the cortical response was the earlier one to be discovered, it was also known to be affected by things like attention and arousal. And when the auditory brainstem response was discovered a little later, once the averaging computer techniques were introduced, then I think research, perhaps at least towards the clinical purposes of threshold estimation using the cortical response, perhaps took a back seat. And the ABR took over as a stiff competitor, if you like, because of course infants, the population to which this was all intended, sleep readily, and so the ABR, whilst not being affected by sleep, also you would prefer, in fact, your patient to be asleep because of the reduced noise and muscle activity that happens in that case. So research into the ABR took off, whereas the cortical responses perhaps took a little bit of a back seat. But it's fair to say that researchers, particularly people like neuroscientists and psychologists, who are interested in not necessarily what we hear but how we hear it, continued to pursue interest in the cortical evoked response. And as well as that, as forms the main interest for today's talk, there are some special populations where the cortical evoked response for threshold estimation is more applicable perhaps than the ABR, and I'm going to try and build a case towards that and convince you of that over the course of the webinar. So that's a little of the history. Now, before we get on to the actual clinical considerations, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the naming and nomenclature of the response that we're talking about today. So as you can see, I've categorized the responses into the cortical responses into basically two broad categories here. On the left we have this list of exogenous potentials. Now, by exogenous, what I'm referring to here is an auditory potential that's primarily influenced by the physical characteristics of the stimulus. So the type of stimulus, the intensity of the stimulus, how frequently the stimulus is presented. And underneath this, in this category, underneath this list, you can see these various different acronyms: CAEP, cortical auditory evoked potential; P1, N1, P2, complex; LLR, long latency response; ALR, auditory late response; slow vertex response, etc., etc. And confusingly, as quite often happens in the field of audiology, all of these different acronyms essentially refer to the same response, which is this P1, N1, P2 complex. And if you're not too sure what that is, don't worry, because in 1 or 2 slides' time I'm going to show a screenshot of what that actually looks like, this complex. But essentially we're all talking about the same thing, but just using slightly different acronyms. And in the interacoustics family, it's the ALR that we tend to concentrate on. So over the course of the webinar, I'll try to use this particular terminology. But what I'm referring to when I use that terminology is the N1 P2 complex. Now, on the right here, as you can see, there's a different category. These are endogenous potentials: MMN, mismatch negativity, P300. Now, endogenous potentials refer to the presence or absence of a response from the auditory cortex, not necessarily dependent on the physical characteristics of the stimulus per se, but more related to internal mental processes that occur as a result of that stimulus. So the context or the task in which it's performed, how novel the stimulus is, etc., etc. Now, we're not going to concentrate on these particular responses today. These in themselves form an entirely different topic, which probably deserves a webinar on each of these individually, so it's beyond the scope of today's talk. But one of the important take-home messages is that, in fact, it's not a black and white distinction between these two categories. And the exogenous potentials that we're going to concentrate on, the ALR, are also influenced by internal mental processes, such as arousal and attention to the stimulus. And vice versa, endogenous potentials can be affected by not just the novelty and relevance of the stimulus and so on, but also the physical characteristics of them. So it's not a black and white distinction. But why this is an important notion to bear in mind is that because the response that we're talking about today, the ALR, because this is influenced by attention and arousal, then this introduces various interesting clinical considerations related to the way in which you handle the patient and so on, which I will cover in due course. But before I do, I did mention that I wanted to show you exactly what we're talking about when we mention this ALR. So this is a screenshot of the on the left hand side here. This is a screenshot of the ALR here. On the x-axis we have time, so the latency of the response, and on the y-axis we have amplitude, or the size of the response. And over here on the right hand side of the screen we have a schematic showing a cross section of the central auditory system, and at least the ascending segment. And what we're talking about when we refer to the auditory late response is responses from the auditory cortex, which is located in the temporal lobes of each hemisphere of the brain, responding to a sound when we play a sound into the ear. And the initial onset response forms this particular complex of waves here, this P1, which occurs depending on the level and other and frequency and other characteristics, somewhere around about 30 to 40 milliseconds typically, and then the N1 P2 complex, which occurs somewhere between 50 or so milliseconds and 200 milliseconds for this complex. And so this is the particular response that we're looking for, and compared with, for example, the ABR that all happens within 5 to 10 milliseconds, this is a considerably longer response. So we can see this time base here, the window, the latency window in which we observe the response is several hundred milliseconds long, including usually a pre-stimulus baseline which we can use to assess the residual noise in the response. And so not only is it a longer response, but by the time the neural signal propagates all the way up to the auditory cortex, then there's many more neurons contributing or generating that response, the ALR, compared with the ABR. So the size of the response is typically bigger for a super threshold signal presented to the ear. We can expect reasonably considerable, 5 to 10 microvolts in amplitude, compared with, say, an ABR wave 5 is, perhaps half a microvolt in amplitude. So it's considerably larger as well. A few technical notes related to the test and recording principles before we move on to some clinical considerations. So what I'm displaying over here on this slide is a frequency schematic of the signal that we pick up using the sensors located on the scalp. So we have frequency by amplitude, and this blue shaded region here shows the neural response of the ABR in relation to the overall signal that we pick up using the sensors. And so the contribution of the ABR, just as a sort of baseline before we talk about the ALR, is of course relatively small. So it's a very small signal to noise ratio, and you can see that it covers a very wide frequency range, does the auditory brainstem response. So in order to pick it up, small signal to noise ratio and wide frequency response, we have very wide filter settings, and we make many recordings, several thousand typically, in order to resolve the auditory brainstem response against the noise. Now, if we turn our attention to this lower panel here, it's the same frequency against amplitude, and the blue shaded region over here represents the energy in the signal that we pick up that can be attributed to the cortical response. And so overall you can see that the signal to noise ratio is much improved compared with the ABR. So typically many fewer averages are required in order to resolve that N1P2 complex against the noise. And you can also see that the main frequency content is far lower for a cortical response than an auditory brainstem response. So we can get away with a far narrower filter setting, and as well as fewer repetitions required. However, the overall time typically to measure an ALR response is quite similar to an auditory brainstem response for adults at least. So the clinical applications of this particular test, well, there are really two in common use. One is this threshold estimation, which I've already sort of referred to, and the second one is objective hearing aid and/or cochlear implant evaluation. Now, this one here, this is an entirely different topic, essentially, that would require a whole webinar devoted to it. So we won't talk about that in too much detail today. Suffice to say that the typical way to evaluate hearing aids in adults would be, of course, questionnaires or something like a speech test. Techniques which aren't appropriate in infants, where they're not able to provide that sort of that feedback. So an objective technique can be used in substitute, and the cortical response lends itself quite well to this particular task. But this is a super threshold signal, and it's usually a complex signal. The auditory cortex in an infant with a hearing aid, of course, isn't mature, and so the cortical response looks very different to the M1P2 complex that we're interested in today. Probably the main most common use across clinics at the moment, at least, is for the ALR for cortical responses is more towards this threshold estimation. And as I say, that's going to be the main focus of the rest of the webinar. And in the same way that in the auditory brainstem response for this role, the clinical question is how low can you observe the presence of wave 5? Well, we have the same question in mind for this response, the ALR, but the difference is how low can we observe the N1P2 complex? And the lowest level that we can observe that response is taken to be threshold. But as I say, the response itself is influenced by subject factors such as attention and arousal, and this introduces a number of complications in terms of patient management and waveform manipulation. So unlike the auditory brainstem response, which is very exogenous in its nature, it's a metronomic response that isn't affected by attention and arousal, and can be obtained in a highly automated fashion, as the interacoustics Eclipse system allows. The same isn't necessarily true of the ALR, and so this introduces a number of challenges, interesting challenges, which make it, I think, a very involving test for the clinician. So in order to maximize the size of the response and maintain the subject's state in the most optimal fashion for obtaining a response, we don't want to present the stimulus in a very systematic and metronomic fashion in the way that we might choose to do for ABR. Instead, we want to randomize the stimulus as much as possible. For example, in terms of the sound level that we present, we might jump that around from one level to the other. The frequency of the stimulus, and the rate at which we present the stimulus. All of these things can be used to make the stimulus unpredictable, and therefore maximise the cortical response, which is an acoustic change response. It's looking for a change in sound in some way. So if we keep changing that sound and make it less predictable, then we'll maximise the response. It can be evoked with complex stimuli like speech, which, as I say, is relevant for things like hearing aid evaluation. Although for audiometric purposes, threshold estimation, we as audiologists tend to favour frequency-specific stimuli. So that implies a tone burst, a tone pip, which I'll show you a screenshot of what that looks like. We also we typically assess the noise by looking at the size, the average gap between several repetitions of a run, including the pre-stimulus interval, which is a period of electrical activity prior to evoking a signal. So it's just the noise in that point, and we can use that to assess the signal-to-noise ratio. And equipment that's optimized for this test will have the ability to generate grand averages quickly. So, as I mentioned, if we continue to present a signal over and over again in a very predictable fashion, the cortex will habituate, and therefore will suffer from essentially the law of diminishing returns. The more we attempt to record a response, the smaller the response will be. So what we need to do is record in short bursts, perhaps 10 to 20 stimulus repetitions at a time, stop, do something else, change the frequency, change the level, etc., record a little more. So we generate many sub-averages, and in order to resolve the signal against the noise, we need to combine all these sub-averages very efficiently into a grand average. And again, this is something that we don't think about necessarily too readily in the ABR. We can just set the response running for several thousand at a time, whereas in the ALR we need to be a little bit more careful about that. So we'll talk about that in the demonstration. Okay. Now here is a screenshot of a colleague, Lee Martin, from the academy here. And we just recorded these together a few weeks ago for this very purpose, threshold estimation using the ALR. So we started at a nice, what was known to be a super threshold level, and here we have the N1 P2 complex. We could also resolve the P1 here. This is sort of a shoulder, a little peak on the shoulder of the N1 negative going wave here, and we simply tracked this response down in level, as you can see, progressively lower in level until we could no longer see the response. And there's a number of things that I'd like you to take from this particular slide. Firstly, the general behaviour of the N1 P2 complex is similar to the ABR in that as we reduce level, then the overall size of the response, the amplitude of the response, taken here from between N1 and P2, the overall size of the response gets less as we reduce in level. And that's very similar to the ABR. And then similarly, the latency of the responses here if we can just look carefully at the N1 as an example, the latency gets progressively longer as we reduce in level as well. So those are the two main behavioural types of change that we can see progressively as we reduce in level. And then the other take-home message that I would like you to take from this slide is that it's only really half the job where to show the lowest level at which a response was present, and in this case it was 20 dB HL to the left here, of course. So that's only really half the job. What we also need to do is show a level below that at which, under good recording conditions, there was a response absent. A response could be shown to be not present. And so again, this is equally as important, if not more important, because, or more challenging at least, because of the need to show the quality of the recording conditions. to estimate the residual noise levels. And when we get onto the live demo in just a few minutes, you might take note that this stage in the recording can often be the most challenging and the longest step in the process. Now, just a few pointers on patient handling. Now, I keep drawing on the ABR as a comparison here. And the ABR is, as we perhaps all know, is unaffected by sleep, and ideally we'd like the patient to go to sleep in order to minimise muscle activity, which we would consider to be noise in the data. Now, for adults, it's not necessarily too easy to get them to readily just drop off to sleep in the same way that it is for infants. So can be quite challenging if you are looking to conduct threshold estimation in an adult for some reason using the ABR in order to get them to sleep at least soundly enough to measure some clear recordings. In the cortical response, the ALR, this isn't the opposite is true. And we'd like them to stay awake, of course. We want the cortex to be responding to sound in the alert and awake condition. And so the actual task for the patient is, of course, to sit in the soundproof booth with the headphones on, and passive attention is perfectly acceptable. So they can just sit. Perhaps they could read. Internally, they might decide to count the stimuli. But most importantly, the eyes need to be open. When the eyes are shut, this changes the frequency response of the ongoing EEG, particularly in the sort of 8 to 10 hertz range. Now, the 8 to 10 hertz range exactly covers the frequency content of the N1 response, so it completely changes the nature of the N1 wave that we're particularly interested in. So we need to make sure that the patient keeps their eyes open throughout. And I've mentioned the ABR in several occasions as a comparison, and so some of you might reasonably wondering, well, why, okay, there's a few challenges and a few advantages and a few disadvantages, but we're very well established with the ALR, with the ABR. What's the purpose? What's the role for this ALR? If we've already got this well-established tool already. Well, what I want to draw your attention to are these three patient categories where the ALR really comes into its own. So there might be individuals who are perhaps unable or unwilling to perform pure tone audiometry reliably. Pure tone audiometry, of course, being the gold standard, the behavioural measure for obtaining a threshold information. And if they're and for the same reasons, it might be that they're unable to sit or behave appropriately for the ABR, sit still enough, or indeed sleep. Whereas the ALR that we're talking about today, because it's such a bigger response, is more robust against myogenic activity, and of course we want them to be awake. So as long as they can sit passively, it should be more of an appropriate test for these individuals. Non-organic in particular, because the response arises from the cortex, then we can take this response to be more of an accurate reflection of the seat of perception, if you like, of the sound. And similarly with medico-legal cases, for example, noise exposure cases or military pension type claims, then there is a potential, albeit subtle, legal loophole there where you could, in theory, have cortical deafness, but still demonstrate a clear auditory brainstem response. Now, this is, of course, in reality, an unlikely situation, but we're talking about legal, loopholes here, which can be closed simply by simply by using the auditory the cortical response. And so we can consider it as an ultimate sort of, from a legal perspective, arbiter of hearing status, in a way that the auditory brainstem response we wouldn't be able to claim that. So the advantage, as I mentioned, demonstrates audibility at the cortex, more resilient to myogenic activity or muscle activity than the auditory brainstem response. And something that I haven't mentioned so far, but it's not problematic at low frequencies. The ABR suffers from temporal smearing of the sound across the basilar membrane, more so for low frequencies than it does for high frequencies, which is why the amplitude is typically less for low frequency 500 hertz stimuli, for example, in the auditory brainstem response. In the auditory late response, the same problems don't occur because the overall length duration of the ALR is a lot longer than the temporal smearing effect on the basilar membrane. So I mentioned the N1P2 complex spans several hundred milliseconds. So 1 or 2 milliseconds worth of smearing across the basilar membrane is relatively less important. But if you talk about the ABR, which overall is only 5-6 milliseconds at high frequencies, at high levels, then a few milliseconds smearing is relatively higher effect on that overall response. So the ALR, the cortical response, isn't so problematic in low frequencies, and in fact we actually tend to see a bigger response in the low frequencies due to the Baselwood extension of excitation on the basilar membrane. So we can use tone bursts, and the tone burst can be long in duration. 80 milliseconds is very common, and because they're so much longer than the very short duration stimuli that we prefer to use in the ABR, then what this means is that we can achieve much higher frequency specificity. There's no transient components to the sound in the same way that there would be for a short duration stimuli. So it allows us to resolve, for example, notched audiograms or steeply sloping audiograms, which are harder to resolve with the auditory brainstem response. But another big advantage is the way in which these stimuli are calibrated. So I've put reference equivalent threshold sound pressure level calibration. So what I mean by this is that the stimuli, as you can see here, I've shown a schematic of one type of stimuli, a 2 kilohertz tone burst, and it gradually comes up. This is the 15 milliseconds rise that I've mentioned. This is the plateau, 50 milliseconds or so would be adequate, and then this is the 15 milliseconds gradual drop. And this length of stimulus is long enough to be calibrated accurately using a microphone in a coupler. And so the method of calibration for these stimuli is exactly the same as that for a normal audiometer, and the stimuli can be referred to in terms of dBHL, hearing level, which is as we use on an audiogram. And this is in contrast to very short duration stimuli, which are used in the auditory brainstem response. And because they're so short duration, they can't reliably be measured using a microphone. They need to be captured electronically using an oscilloscope, and this leads to a different calibration standard, which is known as dBNHL. And this, of course, leads to the need for various correction factors which don't apply in the ALR, the cortical response. So that's a major advantage there. But of course, I mentioned earlier, so there are some disadvantages, attention dependent, age dependent. Now the response itself, the N1P2 complex, doesn't actually become mature until perhaps adolescence. You can measure a cortical response at a younger age, and that would be relevant for hearing aid evaluations, but it's not suitable for threshold estimation. The N1P2 complex, which we need for threshold estimation, doesn't mature until perhaps adolescence. So there's a lower age limit for this test, perhaps of about 12 years old or so. Attention dependent, perhaps a disadvantage, or maybe it's an advantage if you've got a non-organic patient and they're pretending that they can't hear a sound, but internally they can. Then you might wonder whether or not the need to externally act passively as if they can't hear a sound might internally have their attention inextricably drawn to that sound. So as paradoxically it may not actually be a disadvantage, which is what I mean here with this question mark. And as a disadvantage, as I mentioned, there are some issues related to technical, randomizing the stimulus characteristics and so on, which is certainly more demanding of the audiologist. Somewhat fun, I would argue, but perhaps more of a technical challenge, and of course less commonly used than the ABR. So you might wonder whether audiologists are somewhat less familiar with the technique. Very briefly, other issues such as masking would apply as normal. Many of you might be wondering about the accuracy of the test. Well, there have been various studies. This is one that I've picked out as an example, where they measured the cortical response, the ALR, in people with known thresholds, pure tone thresholds, and the ALR can typically get on average around about 6.5 dB accuracy, but certainly within 10 dB under good recording conditions, to within the behavioural threshold. So that's at least as good, if not better, than the ABR in adults for this purpose. Okay, so again, just very briefly, in the interest of time, we'll just slide through this quite quickly. So what's the audiologist actually doing? Well, we'll see in a few moments. They'll be both concentrating on the status of the patient themselves, as well as constantly manipulating the stimuli to maintain that novelty and arousal and attention, and of course generating grand averages in order to resolve the signal against the noise, and then as well as various clinical tasks such as reaching a conclusion, a diagnosis. Now, onto the demonstration. So the electrode montage for the clips, which is a 2-channel system. I'm using this montage over here on the right, where the active electrode is placed on the high forehead, which will reduce the size of the N1P2 response marginally, but at the advantage of convenience by avoiding hair and the palate, the pate. Beg your pardon. Okay, so in terms of impedance, anything below 3 is perfectly acceptable across the four electrodes. And what I've got here, just by way of comparison, is threshold estimated. This is just a screenshot rather than a complete demo. We'll get onto the video in the very next slide, but a screenshot of threshold estimation in an adult with normal hearing using the auditory brainstem response. And this is just at one frequency. You can just maybe make out it's a 2 kilohertz chirp. So normal pure tone thresholds, and the ABR could be resolved all the way down to 20. In this individual. So we consider, if we add on a correction factor to transform from dB NHL to EHL, that clearly if we can see a response at 20 here, then the pure tone threshold would have been within the normal range, and we're happy that at least at this frequency the person's got normal hearing. Now what we did, or clinically normal hearing, should I say. So what we did then, using the same individual and the electrodes applied at the same time and everything else the same, is we immediately switched over and measured the cortical response with the aim of seeing how closely we could replicate this level of accuracy that we found in the ABR in the cortical response. So I'll move on to that now. And this is my video of this very just unmute myself. Okay, so again, what we're going to do is we're going to start at a nice sort of supra threshold level. 80 dB I've chosen in this particular case. And you might remember earlier I just briefly mentioned that if I'm just going to draw your attention over to the left hand side here, We're just, rather than in the ABR scenario where we might record several thousand repetitions just steadily, in this case we're just going to record short bursts of somewhere perhaps between 10 and 20 repetitions and then stop. And this again, it's the same frequency as the previous ABR. We're in the 2 kilohertz range, although this is the tone burst, so it will be more frequency specific. And we're just going to record a relatively low number of these responses, and then we're going to just stop. Now, I mentioned also about the need to randomize and switch between stimuli and levels and so on, although at this high level, this isn't as important as it might become later when we track down to lower levels. But you can see there we've just stopped after a relatively low number, and just looking at the trace itself in the frequency, in the latency range that we're interested in. Down here we're sort of talking somewhere between 50 and 150, 200 milliseconds for that N1P2 complex of the ALR. So we're starting to see something here at this high level. Just what I've done here is I've gone, this is a second sub-average, and again it will be a relatively low number of repetitions. We're just going to record a few of those and then stop, pause, do something different, and just allow that the novelty, if you like, of the stimulus to return, any habituation in the cortex to have subsided. So this is the third sub-average here. So overall, of course, if we add all these together, we're perhaps approaching 40, 50 repetitions. So in a few moments, we'll see these sub-averages become combined into one grand average. And I mentioned that one of the features of a system optimized for this task is to efficiently quickly create grand averages. So in this case it's done by right-clicking on the handle for the waveform, just selecting merge, and there we are with a grand average for a high-level super-threshold stimulus. And what I've done there is I've just looked to demonstrate the residual noise just by showing the alpha and beta buffers, the condensation and rarefaction responses separately, and the gap between the two is a measure of the noise. So then we've labelled the waveforms. I'm happy that there's a response there. We've met our 3:1 target for signal to noise ratio, and that the residual noise is below a criterion level. A typical criterion level for this would be something like 1.5 microvolts. And then what we do is we just come down in level. Of course, remember the nature of the game is to track the N1P2 all the way down to threshold. And so we've just come down by a 20 dB step is perfectly adequate at this point. And we've just come down and measured a short burst of responses, somewhere between 10 and 20 repetitions for 60. And then if you notice there, what we've done is we've stopped, and then we've gone to a different level. So now we're starting to mix things up a little bit. So we've done a few at 60, stopped, gone to 40, done a few at 40, stopped, gone back to 60 now, and we're doing a few more at 60. And we can keep on mixing and changing things around. Now, just mixing level here, it doesn't have to be just level. For example, we could have changed the ear of presentation. I'm not going to actually do that in this demo for the purposes of just time, to get through the demo in the time allowed. But we could have changed ear of presentation. We could, of course, change the stimulus frequency as well. But all the while we're keeping track of the sub-averages, and we're constantly generating grand average for each level. Now this is quite a long, this is around about halfway through the video now, and we remember the auditory brainstem response for this individual was all the way down to 20, so we're going to imagine that we'll at least get that low, and then the final step, of course, is to measure a response below threshold, where we can actually show whether or not there's a response absent under good recording conditions. So we've still got a little way to go, and I've just edited the process to speed that to speed things along a bit. So now you can see that we've measured responses down at 80, 60, 40, and maybe there's something there at 20. Nothing's been labelled yet, but we're at the point now where we're measuring responses at 0. Now the ABR at 0, in the screenshot I showed you previously, there was no ABR and we had a flat trace. So we're wondering whether or not in our comparison in this demonstration the same thing might happen. And so we're really just now attempting to demonstrate whether or not that 20 marker is the lowest level at which we can reliably record a response. And you'll notice there that I'm still trying to mix things up a little bit here. So I've just done a one sub average at 0, then stopped, gone back up to 20, and now I'm doing another sub average at 20. So we're not just sort of linearly running through systematically a number of stimuli. We're trying to mix and match things as much as possible in order to minimize the effects of habituation there. So we're just coming up to 7 or so minutes on this demonstration, so there's a few minutes left to go. And again, I'll just keep drawing your attention to this left-hand side here. So we're in the super threshold responses, we'd probably, in the grand average up here at sort of 80 and 60, you could probably see a response and get the noise down after perhaps 40 or 50 repetitions. But as we move down in level, you can imagine the signal to noise ratio gets progressively less and less, and so therefore in order to resolve the signal against the noise, we would need more repetitions. So it's very possible that close to threshold, perhaps down here at 20, we might need not 40 or 50 repetitions in the grand average, but considerably more than that, maybe 80 or even 100, or even more still. There's no particular set figure. What we want is a response, to measure whether or not a response is there with the residual noise down at a criterion level after however many repetitions that may take. And that residual noise, a good criterion level for that is 1.5 microvolts in this guise. So you can see now that at 20 the response here has been labelled as N1P2. So we're happy that there's a response there, and now the task of the audiologist is to determine whether or not there's a response absent at the next level down, which is what we're doing now. So we're just gathering various sub-averages at this lowest level here. And again, we've just got a minute or two left in the demonstration. Just while we wait for these responses to come through at this lowest level, I'll draw your attention to to this top of the screen here. So this is the ongoing EEG activity that's being fed through the two recording channels of the Eclipse. So this is the same, essentially the same information that I showed right at the beginning when I showed the chart recordings. On that occasion, there were sort of 30 or 40 channels on show, whereas in this system there's only 2 channels, so we see 2 lines, but it's the exact same information. It's just ongoing EEG activity, and because the patient's awake with tension in the neck muscle and sitting upright and maybe the odd movement, of course if they're reading they'll be turning the pages from now and again and blinking and so on, then it's very common to see a number of the repetitions rejected, and it's not necessarily it's not necessarily a problem. We typically have the the gain of the amplifier set low because it's a large response, and the artifact rejection set at, well, ideally at 40 to 50, but it's, in my experience, it's not uncommon to have to lower the artifact rejection criteria to plus minus 80 in order to gather enough data. And what this means, of course, is that we'll be rejecting fewer traces, and we'll be allowing more noise into the data. So it might mean that we need to therefore gather more repetitions as a result to compensate. But on the flip side, of course, we're not going to be necessarily so affected by minor fluctuations, like, as I say, blinking or turning pages and so on. So we're still continuing to gather sufficient grand averages at this lower, sufficient sub-averages to place into the grand average. And what we've done now, we're just assessing the residual noise, again by opening by clicking on the AB buffer and assessing the average gap between the traces. And what the clinicians obviously decided here is that for the 20, the residual noise level didn't meet criteria, so we need to gather a little bit more data just at this level, just to satisfy ourselves that when we say there's a response there at 20, that is a valid conclusion. Again, it's going to be a relatively short sub-average of somewhere between 10 and 20 repetitions, no more than that at a time, and then we'll just add that into the grand average. I think we need to adjust the labels as a result. Exactly where the latency of the P1 lies is just slightly changed as a result of the addition of that final grand average. And now if we check the buffers, we can see that on balance the average gap across the whole latency range of the trace is very low, certainly less than on average 1.5, and so we're happy that when we say there's a response present, that's the case, and that when there's a response absent, that's also the case. And so we can say that on this demonstration at this frequency, clinically we reached the same conclusion as we did with the auditory brainstem response. So we can consider that accuracy is at least as good, but we've measured further up the auditory pathway. So for certain populations, this particular approach would have been preferable. Okay, so that's drawing just to a close my talk. As I mentioned, a little bit about the history and the role of the auditory late response, and I hope that as a result of your participation today, you've got more of a grasp of some of the key clinical considerations and an idea of how to approach this particular measurement in future. So I'll at this point I'll just remute myself and hand over to Hella, and be happy to, of course, take any questions. Oh, finally, I did just want to draw your attention, if you were interested in these further readings, and also just to say thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mike. I see that we have some questions coming in already, so I'll just wait for them to be written. In the meantime, again, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that this webinar has been recorded and you will be able to watch it online. Hopefully in the beginning of next week it will be available. We just need to make it ready for online viewing. So you can always go to our website and have a look at it. Yes, there's some questions now. Let's start with the first one. Are there norms to adults?
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. Yeah, I'm just reading down, and thanks, Halla. Okay, so are there norms to adults? Well, I'm not entirely sure. The purpose of the test here is to estimate threshold for an individual. So when you say norms, that's typically referring to what's on average an average situation of some kind or other. So I'm not entirely sure what you might be getting at there, but there are norms in terms of we have an idea on average how accurate this response is compared with the individual's behavioural threshold. So the accuracy of threshold for cortical evoked potentials, the ALR, compared with someone's behavioural threshold is on average around about 6.5 dB out. So if someone's got a threshold of 10 dB, a particular frequency, then the auditory late response would you might be able to track an ALR down to about 16 or 17 dB on average. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. I've just taken that value there from the study that I cited earlier, Lightfoot and Kennedy. There are others around, and they generally come to a similar figure, something similar or a little less than 10 dB on average. So if we change the elements of the stimuli during the measurement, how do we know which frequency we're testing? Well, yes, so this is where an automated system which is optimized for this test will keep track of exactly what you've measured and when. In systems that are somewhat less optimized for this task, then the workload for the audiologist is higher. Obviously, whenever you measure at one particular frequency or one particular stimulus level or whichever ear, then the trace that's recorded will have the relevant labels. So there's no memory. You don't need to remember what you've done as such, but you do need to keep on top of things and keep the screen in a nicely organized fashion, as I attempted to do in the demonstration, so that you know where you're up to for each particular stimulus condition. So what is the L in the intensity presented on the left, 20L? Yeah, I think that probably refers to whether or not it's the left ear or the right ear that you've stimulated, and the trace will appear blue or red accordingly as well. How much is the result dependent on the interpretation of the examiner compared with the ABR? Oh, this is a really good question. So with the ABR, we've increasingly optimized the test, and provided the clinician with tools to remove the subjectivity. So tools such as the measurement of the residual noise and the FMP ratio for the statistical likelihood of a response being present. So far, at least in the Eclipse system, these tools haven't been implemented in the module for measuring cortical evoked potentials. It's entirely possible to do that, and the principles are exactly the same, but so far we haven't got those features just yet, and so the need for that still relies on the examiner, and so this is why I was showing the A and B buffer, so that subjectively the examiner the examiner needs to read across and potentially even actually physically measure the gap between the different traces in the A and B buffer as a measurement of the noise, the residual noise, and also the amplitude of the signal, the difference between the N1 and the P2 labels, the difference in amplitude, and that can be a measure of your signal. And then it just becomes a case of saying, well, is the signal definitely 3 times higher than the noise? Is the noise definitely 1.5 microvolts or less? So yes, there is a subjective element towards the test here. It's a great question.
Thank you, Mike, for answering all of those questions. I see that we have more questions coming in, so let's see. Yeah, we have another one here. Is it used widely around the world?
Yeah, well, again, I believe that this is probably as a result of a couple of things. Firstly, familiarity with the test. People are very comfortable with the finely tuned and widely used auditory brainstem response, particularly for threshold estimation in infants. But in adults, I mean, you might have, as I've tried to demonstrate, the accuracy of this test in adults is at least as good as the auditory brainstem response, but it has the advantage of measuring further up the auditory pathway. So it's not as widely used, but it potentially has got key advantages. But where it is more used is in those more specialist populations, medical legal cases, non-organics, and so on. And certainly in the UK, which is where is the area where I'm most familiar with, then this test is commonly referred to, is in common knowledge.
I see there's another question coming up here.
Yeah. Thank you, Jos. Let's just read that.
Yeah, I'll just read out loud. Mike, with regards to the subjectivity, if I understand you correctly, you are saying that the result has a similar objectivity to ABR as long as the A and B buffers are used correctly for the noise estimation, and then the 1:3 ratio of the signal is applied, right?
Yeah, I thanks, Jos. I tend to agree with what you're saying now. Just try to be careful with my wording, because the estimation of the noise and the estimation of the signal size isn't actually objective. It's subjective, because the clinician is looking at the screen and making an observation for themselves. Whereas in the ABR module that we have, this information is actually provided objectively. So that was the careful wording that I was trying to convey there. But yeah, if those criteria are met, then one clinician to the other, the consistency of the result should be maintained. Thank you, though, Jos.
I have actually received a question in my mailbox, so I would like you to just answer this. The question is the advantage of ALR over early ABR recordings for cases of workers' compensation seems like a bit of a stretch, especially considering that workers' compensation cases are almost always looking at excessive noise exposure and cochlear damage. It has been my experience, that's David Spadell, that clinicians seem to be more interested in using the ALR for central auditory processing disorder evaluations. Are there any general guidelines or thoughts regarding what clinicians should be looking at in the ALR to determine a potential problem? I hope I got it clear.
Okay, so thank you. Did you say that was David Spidell's question there, Hella?
That is true, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that question. In terms of the first part of it, where he was mentioning, or seemed to think, feels it is a bit of a stretch, for noise-induced. I think the key element which sets this particular test apart is that it tests up to the seat of perception for sounds. So it's maybe a subtle legal loophole as opposed to a clear clinical sort of advantage. But in terms of arbiter for hearing status in case law, it's those legal loopholes that obviously need to be addressed for successful compensation to be awarded. So I think it's clear that with the auditory late response testing up to including the cortex, that it has that particular advantage. In terms of the second part of the question, just to finish off there, sorry, with the noise exposure. I mean, it's probable that many cases of noise exposure, military cases and so on, can be simply resolved with the audiogram, where you look for particular patterns of bulges and notches, and whether or not this falls within or without the typical percentiles for that person's age group. But it's the cases where where hearing may be exaggerated deliberately in order to enhance a claim, where the auditory late response may come into its own over a typical audiogram, which at least could leave itself open to potential for being misled. In terms of the second part of the question, now that was related to auditory processing disorder. And so I think today I've really just sort of focused on the threshold estimation role for this particular test, and it might be that more endogenous potentials such as the MMN or the P300 are sensitive to issues related to auditory processing. So I'm going to leave that, the detailed answer to that question for the time being from this arena. But what I will promise to do is follow that up with a future webinar, because we're always looking for new topics to come onto, and I think that those particular two, the P300 and the MMN, deserve some attention here in the Introacoustics Academy.
Okay, but thank you all, and have a nice day.